Hello, America. My name is Dylan John, and you are listening to Nature and the Nation. For today's episode, I will be looking at The Strange Death of Europe by Douglas Murray. And this was published in 2017. I have the later version from 2018, his second edition, I guess. He's got an added afterword describing some of the horrific events that had occurred in the single year between when he first published it and when he wrote the afterword. Because the horrific events just keep on coming. This is a really good book. It is a really powerful book. I don't always agree with everything that Douglas Murray has to say, but I agree with a lot of things that he says, and I'll leave my disagreements with him about other topics not directly related to the contents of this book for maybe another day. He deserves credit for writing this. It's a powerful book, and it talks about things that need to be talked about and that have not been adequately discussed. There's a lot in Europe and in the United States that has not been adequately discussed for reasons that he talks about here, largely cowardice, the cowardice of the chattering classes to discuss what has been happening to the Western world, which is catastrophic. The things that have happened have been catastrophic, and they continue to happen. This book made me angry, more so, I think, than any other book that I've read. There were many times when I was reading this, I had to stop reading and stand up and go fume, pace around and fume and mutter to myself about how angry I was before I could sit back down again and pick the book back up. It made me very angry. Angry at the people who did this, the people who are responsible for this. Angry at the waves of immigrants that he talks about, but more so, angry at the politicians and the media figures that enabled it. The immigrants are invading, which is what humans have done to other populations for thousands of years. There's nothing particularly new about what the immigrants are doing. We can't let it happen to us. Europe can't let it happen to them. It must be resisted. But the real, truly guilty ones are the treasonous leadership who have allowed it, who have thrown the gates open to the invasion of Europe. And I won't be happy until those people face consequences. So I've got a few sections I want to read from this book, like all of my episodes. I'm going to focus on the first 3 chapters. Really, I'm going to focus mostly on the first chapter, but a little bit from the second and third, because I want to talk primarily about Britain, Great Britain, and what has happened there. And he talks about other places in Europe as well, but he opens up with a discussion of Britain, and so I thought that I would focus on that. You know, as an American, my genetic stock is English. My ancestors are mostly from England, and our country was founded by people of English stock. And so America has a profound connection to Great Britain. And all over the Western world, of course, we're facing these problems. And so what's happened in England and in Great Britain is just a microcosm of what's happening across the Western world. So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to start reading from the very beginning here. Not the absolute beginning, but on the first page, I want to jump in, start reading a little bit of his intro to kind of an overview of the situation. He drops some numbers for us so we can sort of see the scale of what's happening. He says, quote, "In 2002, the latest census for England and Wales was published. Compiled the previous year, it showed the extent to which the country had changed in the decade since the last census was taken. Imagine somebody then in 2002 deciding to extrapolate on the findings in that census. and speculating on what the next 10 years might bring. Imagine that they said, white Britons will become a minority in their own capital city by the end of this decade, and the Muslim population will double in the next 10 years. How would such statements have been greeted? The terms alarmist and scaremongering would certainly have been used, as most likely would racist and, although the coinage was then in its infancy, the word Islamophobe. Safe to say such extrapolations of the data would not have been greeted warmly. Anyone inclined to doubt this might recall just one representative incident when, in 2002, a Times journalist made far less startling comments about likely future immigration, which were denounced by the then Home Secretary David Blunkett, using parliamentary privilege as bordering on fascism. Yet, however abused, anybody offering such analysis in 2002 would have been proved wholly and utterly right. The next census, compiled in 2011 and published at the end of 2012, revealed not just the facts mentioned above, but far more. It proved that the number of people living in England and Wales who had been born overseas had risen by nearly 3 million in the previous decade alone. It showed that only 44.9% of London residents now identified themselves as white British. And it revealed that nearly 3 million people in England and Wales were living in households where not one adult spoke English as their main language. These were very major ethnic changes to a country at any point in time. But they were equally striking findings about the changing religious makeup of Britain. For instance, they revealed that almost every belief was on the rise apart from Christianity. Only Britain's historic national religion was in freefall. Since the previous census, the number of people identifying themselves as Christian had dropped from 72 to 59%. The number of Christians in England and Wales had dropped by more than 4 million, and the number of Christians overall fell from 37 million to 33 million. But while Christianity witnessed this collapse in its followers, a collapse that was only expected to continue precipitately, mass migration assisted a near doubling in the size of the Muslim population. Between 2001 and 2011, the number of Muslims in England and Wales rose from 1.5 million to 2.7 million. While these were the official figures, there was a widespread acceptance that illegal immigrations had made all these numbers far higher. But while Christianity witnessed this collapse in its followers, a collapse that was only expected to continue precipitously, mass migration assisted a near doubling in the size of the Muslim population. Between 2001 and 2011, the number of Muslims in England and Wales rose from 1.5 million to 2.7 million. While these were the official figures, there was a widespread acceptance that illegal immigrations made all these numbers far higher. At least 1 million people were recognized to be in the country illegally, and thus unlikely to have filled in census forms, and the two local authorities which had already grown the fastest, over 20% in 10 years, were those that already had the highest Muslim populations in the UK, Tower Hamlets and Newham. These were also among the areas of the country with the largest non-response to the census, with around 1 in 5 households failing to return the census at all of which suggested that the census results, startling as they were, drastically underrepresented the actual numbers. Nevertheless, the findings were striking. Yet, despite being hard to digest in a year, the story of the census passed by within a couple of days, like any other ephemeral news story. But this was not an ephemeral story. It was an account of the country's recent past, its immediate present, and a glimpse into its inevitable future. To study the results of that census was to stare at one particularly unalterable conclusion, which was that mass immigration was in the process of altering, indeed, had already altered, the country completely. By 2011, Britain had already become a radically different place from the place it had been for centuries. But the response to facts, such as that in 23 of London's 33 boroughs, white Britons were now in a minority, was greeted with a response almost as telling as the results themselves. A spokesman for the Office of National Statistics hailed the results as a tremendous demonstration of diversity. The political and media reaction, meanwhile, was striking for being conducted in only one tone of voice. when politicians of all the main parties addressed the census, they greeted the results solely in a spirit of celebration. It had been the same for years. In 2011, the then mayor of London, Ken Livingstone, spoke with pride about the fact that 35% of people who work in London had been born in a foreign country. The question that lingered was whether there was any optimal limit to this or not. For years, a sense of excitement and optimism about the changes to the country seemed to be the only tone appropriate to strike, bolstered by the pretense that this was nothing new. End quote. Okay, so there's a little bit here just sort of introducing the situation, and we see two censuses, a census from 2001, I guess published in 2002, likewise a census of 2011, released in 2012, and that was the first census, I guess, the 2011 census, that indicated that London had now become minority white British. And it was greeted, of course, with celebration. And it's interesting, he says all parties. It was greeted with politicians from all the main parties. So the Conservative Party, the Tories in the UK, had absolutely nothing to say about this other than praise, which should be an indication for the way this has gone for a very long time. The Conservatives in the UK have been totally ineffective at putting up any defense, not even an ineffective defense, no defense at all, to say that, wait a minute, maybe we shouldn't do this. And he says that if you had seen the original, the data from 2001, because things had already been ongoing, this didn't start in the 21st century, it had already been going on bit by bit through, the previous decades in a slowly accelerating process. But if someone had come across the information in 2002, had seen the 2001 census and had extrapolated what was going to happen, and had predicted that London would become minority British white and that the Muslim population would double, they'd be called all sorts of names, which isn't surprising or, it's hard to disagree with, because anyone who points out any of this stuff is called names. But they would, of course, have been correct. And this is an important thing that we should think about as we move through the sections in this book and we talk about how the British have responded. And we can even talk about how Douglas Murray himself responds to some of the various people who have proclaimed the inevitability of this change, and people who have attempted to speak out about it, and people who have attempted to fight against it. They've been called racists and Islamophobes and scaremongers and so on and so forth for a very long time. What's notable, of course, is that he says that the number of Muslims almost doubled. Looks like Muslims in England and Wales rose from 1.5 million to 2.7 million, but that doesn't count any of the illegal immigrants who didn't respond to the census. And the areas where that have the highest Muslim populations also have the highest population growth and also have the largest non-response to the census. So that's not even considering how many people. He says 1 in 5 households failed to respond. So it's probably significantly more than doubled once you factor in all the illegal immigrants into the UK that are not responding to the census. So the main point here is that this was something that was predictable at the very start of this century. 24 years ago, 23 years ago, it was even predictable before that. It was predictable back in the 90s. It was predictable back in the 60s. People have been kind of seeing what's coming down the pipeline, and it just keeps coming along and coming along. So anyway, let me jump in, continue here. He talks a bit about the earliest immigration to the UK, where he says, quote, "Throughout most of its history, and certainly for the previous millennium, Britain had retained an extraordinarily static population. Even the Norman conquest in 1066, perhaps the most important event in the island's story, led to no more than 5% of the population of England being Norman. What movement there was in the years before and after was almost entirely movement between the island of Ireland and the countries that would eventually comprise the United Kingdom. Then, in the post-1945 period, Britain needed to fill particular gaps in the labor market, especially in the transport sector and the newly created National Health Service. And so the period of mass immigration began, though slowly at first. The 1948 British Nationality Act allowed immigration from the former empire, now the Commonwealth, and by the early 1950s, a few thousand people a year were taking advantage of the scheme. By the end of the decade, the number of newcomers had gone into the tens of thousands, and by the 1960s, the numbers had entered six figures. The vast majority of these arrivals came from the West Indies, as well as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, often entering Britain to do factory work and recommending others, often from their own families or clans, to follow and do similar work in their wake. Despite some public concern about all this and what it meant for the country, neither the Labour nor Conservative governments that alternated in office were able to do much to stem the movement. As with countries on the continent such as France, Holland, and Germany, there was little clarity and little consensus over what the arrival of these workers meant, or even whether they would stay. Only once it became clear that they would stay and would use the opportunity to bring their extended families to join them did some of the implications become clear. During the years that followed, there were highly specific acts of Parliament to address, for instance, criminality among migrants. But there were few attempts to reverse the trend. Even when there was legislation attempting to satisfy growing public concern, this had unexpected consequences. For instance, the 1962 Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which ostensibly aimed to limit the flow of migrants and persuade some to return home, had the opposite effect, persuading many immigrants to bring their entire families into the United Kingdom while they, as they saw it, had the chance. The fact that Commonwealth immigrants no longer had to have a job to come to after 1962 caused another upsurge. It was not until the 1971 Immigration Act that there was any further attempt to stem the resultant flow. So despite the fact that there had never been any plan to allow migration on such a scale, governments of all stripes found themselves forced to deal with the consequences of the situation in which they and the British people found themselves. It was a situation no one had ever accurately predicted, but which had repercussions that every subsequent government would have to react to. The repercussions did include some serious bouts of racial trouble. The Notting Hill riots of 1958 are still remembered for being a violent confrontation between West Indian immigrants and white Londoners. But such flashpoints are remembered precisely because they were the exception rather than the rule. While low-level suspicion and concerns about outsiders undoubtedly existed, all efforts to capitalize on such unrest were a consistent and wholesale failure, notably those of Oswald Mosley, former leader of the British Union of Fascists and now head of the Union movement. When Mosley tried to take electoral advantage of the Notting Hill riots and run for Parliament in the general election of 1959, his share of the vote did not even make it into double digits. The British people recognized that there were issues arising from large-scale immigration, but they also showed that they knew the answers did not lie with extremists who they had seen off before." End quote. So, a couple things here that are just infuriatingly, maddeningly insane, which is that initially, in the post-1945 Britain, he says Britain needed to fill particular gaps in the labor market, especially in the transport sector and the newly created National Health Service. Well, I find that hard to believe, honestly, that there are these gaps in the labor market that need to be filled. That's what you train people for. That's what you educate people for. That's why you have programs to get people trained. And these gaps in the National Health Service, I wonder why exactly that would be the case, particularly with the National Health Service. Was World War II particularly damaging to doctors and nurses? Certainly there are nurses and medics in war, but I would think they might have a lower casualty rate, and I would imagine a lot of people got trained through military service in how to do those sorts of things. I can't imagine that the National Health Service had a particular labor shortage as opposed to some other thing that might be more inclined to have crossover with the soldiers that may have been killed. Now, I'm no expert on Great Britain, but something there doesn't seem to add up to me, and it just seems obvious that there's, to me, I think there's no such thing as a labor shortage in a particular industry. You just raise the wages, and that attracts more people to enter the market, to enter the particular field that you want people to work in. If there's a shortage, wages go up as a natural response. It's not the case that every time there's some sort of a shortage of workers, the solution is to bring in people. Prices fluctuate as a result of supply and demand. This is how economics works. If there's a shortage of workers, that just means that there's not enough people selling their labor at a given market rate. And the natural response to that would be the price of labor would go up. Wages would go up, and that would draw people into those fields, and it would become lucrative to provide training opportunities. Many people would want to be able to get in and get access to those wages, and so they would be participating in training opportunities, which would become a profitable endeavor to teach people how to do these things. The market can solve these problems. It's not the case that rather than raising wages for workers, the solution is instead to import those workers. That's just not. There's no economic law that says like that's the solution or that's the appropriate solution. It just doesn't make sense. But moreover, it seems like, and I'm not faulting Douglas Murray for saying some of these things. This is just how it was. There were a number of acts. The 1962 Commonwealth Immigration Act ostensibly aimed to limit the flow of migrants, but it had the opposite effect. So right off the bat, I see, so first off, they start bringing people in right after World War II. They start bringing people in, and then by 62, they're dealing with some kind of problem, right? So now we're going to pass a law ostensibly to limit the flow of migrants. So right off the bat, by 1962, you know that there's a problem. People are pushing for some sort of reform to change the laws that are allowing everybody in. And what we find is total incompetence from the leadership of the UK. And here's you have to wonder, you always have to wonder, how incompetent can these people really be? If you make your way into the leadership of a first world country, if you're the leaders, if you're among the leaders of the United Kingdom, you're not a dummy. No dummy gets to that position. You have to be kind of smart to get yourself into Parliament and into the upper echelons of the bureaucracy. And those aren't, and so the kind of presumption that these guys are stupid, or they just had no idea what the laws that they were passing were going to do, that doesn't make sense. That doesn't fly to me. They must have known. They must have had some inkling of what the consequences of the laws they were passing actually were. It's either they were malicious and lying, or grossly incompetent, and it's a pattern that has been repeated from 1962 being generous, but I would say it's a pattern repeated since 1945 because it was stupid in the first place. If they had to fix the problem in 1962, then that means that somebody previously had created the problem that had to get fixed. So even back in 1945, when they started bringing people in to supposedly fill the labor shortage, they were already doing something that they had no concept of what the consequences were, so that within less than 20 years later, they're trying to figure out how to undo what they've already done. So they pass a law in 62, and then that one doesn't work and backfires and has the opposite effect. And it's like a Monty Python episode. It's like the Keystone Cops, Larry, Moe, and Curly. Like the leaders are morons, and they're bumbling after bumbling after bumbling, unable to fix any of the problems. They try and they try and they try, but nobody can figure out how to do it. I feel like they're in the halls of Parliament with wearing colanders on their heads, like a bunch of clowns. Are they fools or are they traitors? There's no other option. So, and then he says that then there was there were these riots, the Notting Hill riots of '58, and that's a violent confrontation between West Indian immigrants and white Londoners. And Oswald Mosley attempts to sort of take advantage of these riots and use general discontent against the situation to run for parliament, and he doesn't even get double digits in his share of the election that he was running in. So he was deeply rejected, and so that seems like a failure of the British people, because Oswald Mosley seems like, in retrospect, when we look back and say, all the people that endorsed these policies endorsed policies that have been catastrophic failures for the United Kingdom. And the one guy who says, you know what, I'm going to call it like it is, and I'm going to point out what a failure this all is, and I'm going to turn it around, and I'm going to fix it, but the British people don't support him. So, Murray seems to have a sort of, even now, after everything that we know, by 2017 when he's writing this, he still kind of looks back and says, well, the British people realized that although there were, his last sentence, the British people recognized that there were issues arising from large-scale immigration. But they also showed that they knew the answers did not lie with extremists who they had seen off before. So even Douglas Murray himself seems to be saying, well, Oswald Mosley was an extremist, so we know that he didn't really have the answers. That wasn't really the right way. He was too extreme. Douglas Murray himself and many other people have been called all sorts of names, including extremists, Nazis, and everything else. But then Douglas Murray himself engages in a little bit of name-calling as Oswald Mosley as an extremist. But it seems like if Oswald Mosley had been elected and his ideas had been implemented, this book wouldn't even have had to have been written, because none of these problems would have arisen. So whatever the preferred option was over Mosley, clearly it didn't work. Anyway, I'm going to keep moving here. We jump into Enoch Powell and we jump into the 1960s. He says, quote, an April 1968 poll by Gallup found that 75% of the British public believed that controls on immigration were not strict enough. That figure would soon rise to 83%. At this point, there arose the only moment when immigration briefly had the potential to become a major political issue. In that same month, the then conservative shadow cabinet minister Enoch Powell gave a speech to a conservative association in Birmingham that opened out the debate and just as quickly closed it down. Although it didn't quite use the words by which it became known, the Rivers of Blood speech was filled with prophetic foreboding about the future of Britain if immigration continued at its then current rate. Those whom the gods wish to destroy, they first make mad, declared Powell. We must be mad, literally mad, as a nation to be permitting the annual inflow of some 50,000 dependents, who are, for the most part, the material of the future growth of the immigrant-descended population. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. Although Powell's speech was about identity and his country's future, it was also about practical concerns, about constituents finding hospital places or school places for their children in a stretched public sector. Powell was immediately relieved of his position in the shadow cabinet by his party's leader, Edward Heath, and any mainstream political support Powell might have garnered, not to mention his own political future, was over. Yet, public support for his views was high, with opinion polls showing around 3/4 of the general public agreeing with his sentiments, and 69% believing that Heath had been wrong to sack him. Many years later, one of Powell's Conservative Party opponents, Michael Heseltine, said that if Powell had stood for the leadership of the Conservative Party in the aftermath of that speech, he would have won by a landslide, and that if he had stood to be Prime Minister, he would have won by a national landslide. But politically, there was no way through for Powell, and his career did not merely falter, but remained in the political wilderness for the remaining decades of his life. Ever since the Rivers of Blood speech, common wisdom in Britain has had it that Powell's intervention not only wrecked his own career, but wrecked any possibility of a full or frank immigration debate in Britain for at least a generation. So lurid were Powell's terms and so dire his warnings that anybody concerned about immigration for evermore risked being tarred as a Powellite. Certainly parts of Powell's speech made it too easy for his political opponents to attack him and gave far too much cover for people away to his political right. But among things most striking when reading his speech and the reactions to it today are the portions for which he was lambasted that now seem almost understated. For instance, Powell's insistence that there was a street in Britain on which only one white woman was living. In subsequent interviews and discussions, the case of this woman was widely dismissed as a fabrication because it was believed that no such street could exist. However, if anyone had suggested to Powell in 1968 that he should use his Birmingham speech to predict that within the lifespan of most people listening, those who identified as white British would be a minority in their capital city, he would have dismissed such an advisor as a maniac. As was the case in each of the other European countries, even the most famous prophet of immigration doom, in fact, underestimated and understated the case. The truth behind Powell's intervention made immigration an impossible discussion for a generation was that his intervention, and the heat it unleashed, allowed politicians to excuse themselves from addressing the implications of their policy. Many had clearly concluded that the trajectory the country was on was unalterable. During the 1960s, there was still parliamentary debate over returning immigrants to their country of origin if, for instance, they committed a crime in Britain. Later, there was legislation to prevent the habit of marriages of convenience, carried out solely in order to gain citizenship. But by the 1970s and 1980s, the size of the immigrant community meant it was plain that any policy aimed at diminishing the size of that community was impossible, even if it was deemed desirable. As with countries across the continent, Britain was in a position that it had not intended to be in, and would have to improvise its reactions to whatever challenges and benefits this new reality produced. But it was a measure of the unspoken concern about what these challenges comprised that throughout this period, even the most straightforward expressions of truth became impossible to voice. End quote. So again, another maddeningly frustrating section where I think I had to stand up and vent a little bit before I sat down and continued reading. How Enoch Powell was right about everything. In retrospect, we know he was right about everything. We also know that the British public supported him. It was stated by one of his fellow members of parliament that if Enoch Powell had been in the position to run for prime minister, he would have won in a landslide. The people of Great Britain supported Enoch Powell. And yet, the leader of his own party, the Conservative Party, back in the 1960s, okay, this is not the modern woke era. Even in the 1960s, Enoch Powell's observations about immigration, which were 100% correct, if not understated, led to him being relieved of his position by the head of the Conservative Party. The Conservatives were feckless, useless, even back in 1968. Would not stand by the only member of their party who was telling the truth. And this is where the problem comes from, again and again and again. The politicians are weak and stupid, and or treasonous. It boggles the mind how it is that there was only one guy who was able to recognize what was plainly obvious to the vast majority of the population of Britain. Everybody agreed with him, and yet none of the other politicians stood up and supported him. Nobody else was willing to agree with him and say that actually he's right. And so it just stands to reason that in retrospect, we can say that the politicians were significantly more stupid than the average population. They were significantly more compromised. They were significantly more cowardly. It's hard to pinpoint what exactly the problem was, but something was wrong with the politicians then and now. But it boggles the mind that after, this is 1968. This is only just a little bit over 20 years after World War II, when they first started bringing in people. And already the population within just over 20 years is deeply opposed to what is happening. The population of the UK realized this immediately, what was going on. They realized it very quickly. And it has happened from 1968 till now that they have been utterly incapable. The people of Britain have been utterly incapable of getting their will manifested in public policy. Now that, to me, speaks to more than just a failure of the politicians, which it is, but it's also a failure of the system. How is it that the people of Britain are totally incapable of making their will manifest? Totally incapable of keeping their politicians supporting their policies. If the people of the UK supported Enoch Powell by such a significant margin, why were they unable to put him in power? The powers that be, the elites in the UK, were able to dictate Enoch Powell's career. The media, his fellow members of parliament, they decided what Enoch Powell's career would be, rather than the people who supported him putting him in power. And it's my contention that the UK has a deeply flawed system that gives all of its power to its elites, and the people of the UK really do not live in a democracy. Their will is not manifested. They don't have the capacity to steer their country, which is a serious crisis. Anyway, let's jump forward to the 80s and 90s. He says, quote, "In January 1984, the headmaster of a school in Bradford, Ray Honeyford, published a piece in a small circulation magazine called the Salisbury Review, in which he reflected on some aspects of running a school in an area where 90% of the pupils were of immigrant parents. He mentioned the refusal of some Muslim parents to permit their daughters to participate in dance classes, drama, or sport, and the silence of the authorities on this and other cultural practices, such as taking children back to Pakistan during term time. He also argued for pupils to be encouraged to speak the language and understand the culture of the country they were living in, and not to be encouraged to live, as Honeyford argued the race relations leadership were trying to encourage them to do, parallel lives within society." A campaign against Honeyford was swiftly organized by the race relations industry he had used part of his article to criticize. The Muslim mayor of Bradford demanded Honeyford be sacked, accusing him even years later of, among other things, cultural chauvinism. Amid protests and nationwide cries of racist, Honeyford was forced out of his job and never again worked in education. He had said in his offending article that thanks to a corruption of politics and even of language, it was difficult to write honestly about these matters. And his own treatment more than proved that point. Why should a popular headmaster, about whom there were no other complaints, have been forced into retirement for making such an argument? The only explanation is that, at the time, even plain truths about these matters had not yet become palatable. A political and social paradigm, uncomfortably referred to as multiculturalism, had begun, and in 1984 it was not yet possible to shatter the basis of that belief. Although it would have been scant consolation to Ray Honeyford, within a couple of decades of his article's publication, many more people were saying that perhaps he had been onto something, and by the time of his death, in 2012, the thrust of his argument had become widely accepted. During the 1980s and 1990s, under the new rubric of multiculturalism, a steady stream of immigration into Britain continued from the Indian subcontinent and elsewhere, but an unspoken consensus existed whereby immigration, while always trending upwards, was quietly limited. What happened then, after the Labour Party's landslide election victory in 1997, was a breaking of that consensus. Although neither a manifesto commitment nor a stated aim, once in power, Tony Blair's government oversaw an opening of the borders on a scale unparalleled even in the post-war decades. They abolished the primary purpose rule, which had attempted to filter out bogus marriage applications. They opened the borders to anyone deemed essential to the British economy, a definition so broad that it included restaurant workers as skilled laborers. And as well as opening the door to the rest of the world, they opened the borders to the new EU member states of Eastern Europe. It was the effects of all of this and more that created the picture of the country revealed in the 2011 census. Of course, there are various claims as to how this post-1997 immigration surge occurred. One, famously made in 2009 by the former Labor speechwriter Andrew Neither, was that Tony Blair's government willfully eased the immigration rules because they wanted to rub the right's nose in diversity and create what they unwisely took to be an electorate that would subsequently be loyal to the Labor Party. After the outcry caused by his 2009 recollection, Neither qualified this particular memory. Other Labor officials from those years began to say they had no idea who Neither was, but it was not hard to see how anyone, however junior, could have come away with such an impression of what was happening in those years. For instance, it was clear from the moment of her appointment as Minister for Asylum and Immigration during Tony Blair's first term that Barbara Roche was seeking a complete rethink of Britain's immigration and asylum policies. While the Prime Minister was concentrating on other matters, Roche changed every aspect of the British government's policies. From here onward, all people claiming to be asylum seekers would be allowed to stay in Britain, whether they were genuine or not. Because, as she informed one official, removal takes too long and it's emotional. Roche also thought the contemporary restraints on immigration were racist, and that the whole atmosphere around the immigration debate was toxic. Over her period in office, she repeatedly stated her ambition to transform Britain. As one colleague said, Roche didn't see her job as controlling entry into Britain, but by looking at the wider picture in a holistic way, she wanted us to see the benefit of a multicultural society. Neither the Prime Minister nor the Home Secretary Jack Straw were interested in questioning the new asylum policy, nor the fact that under Roche, everyone entering Britain, whether he or she had a job to go to or not, was turned into an economic migrant. Wherever there was any criticism of her policy, either internally or externally, Roche dismissed it as racist. Indeed, Roche, who criticized colleagues for being too white, insisted that even the mention of immigration policy was racist. What she and a few others around her saw was a wholesale change of British society. Roche, a descendant of East End Jews, believed that immigration was only ever a good thing. 10 years after the changes she had brought about, she told an interviewer with satisfaction, "I love the diversity of London. I just feel comfortable." The activities of Roche and a few others in the 1997 Labour government backs up the idea that theirs was a deliberate policy of societal transformation, a culture war being waged against the British people, using immigrants as some kind of battering ram. Another theory, not running entirely counter to this view, is that the whole thing was a bureaucratic cock-up that had already run out of control under successive governments and only did so spectacularly under New Labour. The disparity between the figures of new arrivals into the country that the Labour government claimed to expect as compared to those who actually came, is evidence for this case. For instance, when it allowed free entry to the United Kingdom for the new EU accession countries in 2004, the British government announced that it expected around 13,000 people a year to take advantage of the scheme. A study commissioned by the government claimed that it would be able to totally control the flood. Once restrictions had been lifted, it did no such thing. Rules around work permits, among others, were reformed so that skilled and unskilled immigrants could enter the country and stay under the guise of being foreign workers. Most would stay. Entirely predictably, the numbers soon ran away even from the estimates of the greatest advocates of mass migration. The numbers of non-EU nationals were expected only to double between 100,000 a year in 1997 and 170,000 in 2004. In fact, over 5 years, the government's predictions for the number of new arrivals would be off by almost 1 million people. Among other things, the government's experts wholly failed to anticipate that the UK might be an especially attractive destination for people from countries with significantly lower average income levels or without a minimum wage. In the event, because of these policies, the number of Eastern Europeans living in Britain rose from 170,000 in 2004 to 1.24 million in 2013, end quote. So there's some utterly maddening content there. We get the headmaster from the school who wrote an article in a small magazine talking about some of the problems that he has encountered by teaching students where most of the students are from immigrant parents. Of course, he loses his job and everybody hates him. The whole nation pursues him, calls him racist, massive campaign, the mayor's after him. He's right. He's proven right in the end. This is an ongoing pattern where the people who everybody denounces as racist were proven right in the end. He lost his job. But you have to wonder, did the public agree with him? He doesn't really say. Douglas Murray doesn't really say here, but what was this campaign against this guy? It was a campaign by the local Muslims, and it was a campaign by the social justice warriors and the progressives and the immigration fanatics and the elites. But I repeat myself. But was it a campaign by the people of Britain? They don't seem to agree with the massive immigration. Nowhere have we encountered anything indicating that the British people want this. And yet he's driven out of his position, despite the fact that at the end of the day, he's proven correct. But what really is maddening is the Labour Party's landslide election victory in 1997. What it was that prompted this landslide victory, I really can't say. I don't study UK politics enough to know. I know Margaret Thatcher. I feel like Margaret Thatcher was pretty successful and popular. She was a conservative in the 80s, prime minister, and she, I thought, was pretty popular. But by 1997, Labour wins in a landslide and throws all restrictions out the window and throws the door wide open. Tony Blair throws the door wide open. And more specifically, Tony Blair's Minister for Asylum and Immigration, Barbara Roche, really was the one who threw the doors open. She doesn't want to remove anyone because it takes too long and it's emotional. And she accuses everyone of racism. Anyone who criticizes anything she does or says, she accuses them of racism. She seems like the absolute worst of the worst, but he says the Prime Minister and the Home Secretary had no interest in putting a leash on this lady, so she got free rein to throw the doors open. And she was Jewish, and so I'm sure I've got listeners who will think, obviously, and it's hard to argue sometimes when we find that the most enthusiastic supporters of the elimination of national borders are Jews, but I think that's partly correct. Maybe it's also largely incorrect in that the push for the mass immigration is coming from all quarters. It comes from the Catholic Church. I'm sure it was coming from the Church of England. I guarantee it. The secular progressives and the conservatives were pretty useless as well. So all across the spectrum, anybody in a position of power was pushing this. So Barbara Roche, the Jew, was pushing it pretty hard, but she certainly wasn't the only one. But at any rate, what's also totally unsurprising is that they said they were going to be about 13,000 people a year coming from the EU. That was in 2004. Millions of people showed up. Well, the number of Eastern Europeans in Britain went from 170,000 in 2004, the year that this prediction of 13,000 people a year, over the course of the next 9 years, it increases by, let's say, over 900,000. My quick mental math there. Far cry from 13,000 a year, probably nearly 10 times that. Totally underestimated. Again and again and again and again. You know, when something happens a million times, it's no longer an isolated incident. It's a pattern. Underestimate the number of people who will show up. No clue how you're going to deal with them when they get there. No clue what the ramifications of their arrival will be. These people should be in prison. These people should be in prison, at the least. They should be tried for treason and given the appropriate punishment. At the very least, these people should be in prison. What they've done to the United Kingdom and all across Europe. But anyway, let's see how the British people responded to this. This is a somewhat briefer section where he says, quote, "Such massive underestimations of the scale of migration were, of course, predictable to anybody with any knowledge of the history of post-war immigration, a history that had been replete with vast underestimates of the numbers expected to come. But it did also partly demonstrate that detailed attention to immigration control was simply not a priority in those early labor years. Most importantly, the impression that all immigration restriction was racist, even restriction of white Eastern Europeans, made any internal and external opposition hard to voice. Whether the policy of a surge in migration was unnoticed or officially approved, it was certainly not opposed within the British government. Whatever the cause or motive, what is rarely remarked upon is that the public response to the massive upsurge in immigration and to the swift transformation of parts of Britain was exceptionally tolerant. There were no significant or sustained outbreaks of racist sentiment or violence over the following decade, and the country's only racist political party, the British National Party, was subsequently destroyed at the polls. Opinion surveys and the simple evidence of living in the country show that most people continued to feel zero personal animosity towards immigrants or people of a different ethnic background. But poll after poll did show that a majority were deeply worried about what all this meant for the country and its future. In spite of this, even the mildest attempts by the political class to raise these issues, such as a 2005 conservative election campaign poster suggesting limits on immigration, were condemned by the rest of the political class, with the result that there was still no serious public discussion. Perhaps successive governments of all stripes have spent decades putting off any real discussion of this issue because they suspected not only that the public disagreed with them, but that it was a matter on which control had slipped away. The Conservative Party that formed a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats in 2010 had promised to cut immigration from hundreds of thousands a year to tens of thousands, a promise they repeated in office, but they never got anywhere near that target. Neither did the successor Conservative majority government, despite mooring itself to the same promise. Indeed, after 5 years of a coalition government and the start of a conservative government, both of which were committed to reducing immigration, not only had immigration not gone down, it had actually risen to another record net immigration high of 330,000 a year. End quote. So, again, more maddening stuff. And first of all, endless underestimations, constant accusations of racism, and he remarks on how tolerant the public was to all this, and he calls the British National Party racist, and how they were destroyed at the polls. And it seems as though anytime somebody talks about it, he says, you know, the people were worried about what this meant, right? Polls show that the public is worried. Well, but what does it mean to be worried? But as soon as a party comes up and says, we're going to do something about it, the British National Party, even Douglas Murray says they're racist. So in the very following paragraph, when he says that all discussion of immigration restriction was branded racist, so Murray is like, hey, the discussion is okay. We should be allowed to have the discussion. But to do anything about it, that's another story. You know, the conservatives failed and failed and failed, and he talks in the following paragraph about how the Conservative Party promised and promised and promised when they formed a coalition government with the Lib Dems, and then again when they had pure majority, they continued talking about cutting immigration, and all of their promises were lies. They failed to do anything, and the immigration continued to go up to reach new record high levels. So it seems to me that it should be obvious to people after Enoch Powell and after the prior 50 plus years that the Conservative Party is not reliable on this issue. The Conservative Party isn't going to do anything. But when the British National Party says they're going to do something, even Douglas Murray says they were racist, and it proves the tolerance of the British people that the British National Party failed. Well, I wish the British National Party hadn't failed, because it seems like the only party in Britain that could potentially have done anything. The constant fear of being called a racist, and the constant rightward punching that whoever's slightly to the right of you, they're the racists. It's so counterproductive. Nothing gets done. Everybody is free to complain. In the perfect world, everyone is free to complain, but nobody is free to act. Anyway, let me continue. He talks a little bit about how politicians have responded to this situation. He says, quote, "Although there were differences in post-war immigration, each European country had the similar experience of a short-term policy creating the longest possible repercussions. Each country found itself playing endless catch-up, the result of the need to make up major policy decisions on the hoof. And in each country, the debate similarly shifted with decades. As the predictions of the 1950s were shown to be wrong, so were those of the subsequent decades. Expectations of the numbers that would come, as opposed to the numbers that actually did come, saw endless disparities in every country. And while government statistics told one story, the eyes of the European publics told another. In response to public concern, governments and mainstream parties of all political stripes talked about controlling immigration, sometimes even getting stuck in a competition to sound tougher than each other on the matter. But as the years went on, it began to seem as though this might merely be an electoral trick. The gap between public opinion and political reality began to look like a gap caused by other factors than a lack of will or deafness to public concerns. Perhaps nothing was done to reverse the trend because no one in power believed anything could be done. If this was a political truth, then it remained wholly unmentionable. Nobody could get elected on such a platform, and so a continent-wide tradition arose of politicians saying things and making promises they knew to be unachievable. Perhaps it is because of this that the principal reaction to the developing reality began to be to turn on those who expressed any concern about it, even when they reflected the views of the general public. Instead of addressing concerns, politicians and press began to throw accusations back at the public. This was done not just through charges of racism and bigotry, but in a series of deflecting tactics that became a replacement for action. All of these were identifiable in the wake of Britain's 2011 census, including the demand that the public should just get over it. In a column titled, "Let's Not Dwell on Immigration, but Sow the Seeds of Integration," the then Conservative Mayor of London, Boris Johnson, responded to that census by saying, "We need to stop moaning about the dam burst. It's happened. There's nothing we can do now except make the process of absorption as eupeptic as possible." Sundar Katwala, from the left-wing think tank British Future, responded to the census in a similar tone, saying, "The question of do you want this to happen or don't you want this to happen implies that you've got a choice, and you could say, let's not have any diversity. But this was not possible," he insisted. "This is who we are. It's inevitable." Perhaps both were right in simply saying what any politician surveying the situation would have to say, but there is something cold about the tone of such remarks, not least the absence of any sense that there may be other people out there not willing to simply get over it, who dislike the alteration of their society and never asked for it. Indeed, it seemed to have struck neither Johnson nor Katwala that there are those who may sustain a degree of anger about the fact that all the main parties had for years taken a decision so wholly at variance with public opinion. At the very least, it seemed to occur to neither that there is something profoundly politically disenfranchising about such talk, not only because it suggests a finality to a story that is in fact ongoing, but because it adopts a tone more ordinarily directed at some revanchist minority rather than towards a majority of the voting public. In the same month that these insistences that people get over it emerged, a poll by YouGov found 67% of the British public believed that immigration over the previous decade had been a bad thing for Britain. Only 11% believed it had been a good thing. This included majorities among voters for every one of the three major parties. Poll after poll, both before and since, have found the same thing. As well as routinely prioritizing immigration as their number one concern, a majority of voters in Britain regularly described immigration as having had a negative impact on their public services and housing through overcrowding, as well as harming the nation's sense of identity. Of course, the political impetus to draw a line and not get into blame games raises the possibility that, having gotten away with their mistakes to date, the politicians may feel ready, after such suitable imprecations, to repeat precisely the same mistakes in the future. By 2012, the leaders of every one of the major parties in Britain had conceded that immigration was too high, but even whilst doing so, all had insisted that the public should get over it. None had any clear, nor as it would turn out successful, policy on how to change course. Public opinion surveys suggest that a failure to do anything about immigration, even while talking about it, is one of the key causes of the breakdown in trust between the electorate and their political representatives. End quote. So on and on and on, we see the same thing. The people don't support it. The polls don't support it. The predictions are all wrong. Same thing's happening all across Europe and every country. Everybody keeps making promises. The politicians keep making promises of how they're going to fix it, but they also, they're talking out two sides of their mouth. They sort of say they're going to fix it, but they don't really mean it, because what they really mean is that people need to get over it. Or they might concede that it's been a little out of control, but there's nothing to be done now, so people should get over it. Boris Johnson, who was a massive disappointment when he was mayor of London, there's no moaning about it. It's happened. There's nothing we can do now except try to make the process of absorption as eupeptic as possible. And then this other fellow from some think tank, British think tank, saying, you don't really have a choice. When we talk about it, whether you want it to happen or you don't want it to happen, implies that you have some choice. You don't have a choice in the matter. The absolute hubris of these people. Dictating to the British public. Not even dictating to a minority that's in disagreement, but the elites dictating to the majority of the British public, telling them how it's going to be. Again, they should be in jail. The polls continue. 67% of people believe the immigration over the past decade has been a bad thing. Only 11% think it's been a good thing. And that was looks like that was back in response to the 2011 poll. So that must have been released in 2012. So the British people have been saying the same thing for decades upon decades upon decades, and being fed lies or scorn by the people who are fundamentally, permanently transforming the United Kingdom against the will of the citizens of the nation. There's no other term to describe this but treason. Handing the country to foreigners, despite the will of the people. How else could you possibly describe it? There are no other words. It's treason. Then, of course, we get to the rape gangs, which I haven't even touched on that topic yet. You can tell I hate these people that did this to the United Kingdom. I hate them. He says, quote, the January before the release of the 2011 census results, a gang of 9 Muslim men, 7 of Pakistani origin, 2 from North Africa, were convicted and sentenced at the Old Bailey in London for the sex trafficking of children between the ages of 11 and 15. On that occasion, one of the victims, sold into a form of modern-day slavery, was a girl of 11 who was branded with the initial of her owner, abuser, M for Mohammed. The court heard that Mohammed branded her to make her his property and to ensure others knew about it. This did not happen in a Saudi or Pakistani backwater, nor even in one of the northern towns that so much of the country had forgotten about and which had seen so many similar cases over the same period. This happened in Oxfordshire between 2004 and 2012. Nobody could argue that gang rape or child abuse are the preserve of immigrants, but the development of particular types of child rape gangs revealed, and a subsequent government-commissioned inquiry confirmed, specific cultural ideas and attitudes that were clearly held by some immigrants. These include views about women, specifically non-Muslim women, other religions, races, and sexual minorities that were pre-medieval. Fear of accusations of racism for pointing out such facts, and the small but salutary number of careers like Ray Honeyford's that had been publicly wrecked for saying far less, meant that it took years even for such facts as these to come out. This had a terrorizing effect far beyond the nation's television studios, and with far more serious consequences. When these rape gang cases came to court, they did so in spite of local police, counselors, and care workers, many of whom were discovered to have failed to report such crimes involving immigrant gangs for fear of accusations of racism. The media followed suit, filling their reports with euphemisms, as though trying to avoid helping the public to draw any conclusions. So, in cases like those in Oxfordshire, the gangs were described as Asian, when they almost solely involved Muslim men of Pakistani origin. The fact that their victims were chosen precisely because they were not Muslims was only occasionally mentioned in the courts and rarely dwelt upon by the press. Instead of carrying out their jobs without fear or favor, police, prosecutors, and journalists behaved as though their job was to mediate between the public and the facts. Naturally, none of this ever comes up in any acceptable discussion on immigration. Introducing gang rape to a BBC discussion on immigration would be like introducing bestiality to a documentary on sickly pets. Only the good and happy can be dwelt upon, while the bad is ignored. And it is not only the harder edges of the discussion that get lost, but the softer, everyday concerns that people have. Not savage denunciations, but simple regret that the society they grew up in has been changed without any care for the views of the majority of the people. End quote. So here we start to get a taste of the real consequences of the total feckless cowardice betrayals committed upon the British people by people in authority. The police, the counselors, the social workers, the courts, the press, everybody in the UK with any bit of authority betrayed the people, betrayed the children, and handed the children to foreign rape gangs for years, and didn't want to say anything or do anything or act in any way or tell the people the truth because they didn't want to get called racists. Cowardly fools. There's no punishment too severe. I mean that sincerely. And then one last bit about these rape gangs. He says, quote, "It was in the early 2000s in England that stories that the sick and white working class communities had been telling for years were finally investigated by the media. These revealed that the organized grooming of often underage young girls by gangs of Muslim men of North African or Pakistani background was a theme in towns throughout the north of England and further afield. In each case, the local police had been too scared to look into the issue. And when the media finally looked into it, they too shied away. A 2004 documentary on social services in Bradford had its screening postponed after self-proclaimed anti-fascists and local police chiefs appealed to Channel 4 to drop the documentary. The sections that dealt with the sexual exploitation of white girls by Asian gangs were accused of being potentially inflammatory. In particular, these authorities insisted the screening ahead of local elections could assist the British National Party at the polls. The documentary was finally screened months after the elections, but everything about this case and the details that followed provided a microcosm of a problem and a reaction which were going to spread across Europe. Campaigning on, or even mentioning the issue of grooming during those years brought with it terrible problems. When the Northern Labour MP Anne Cryer took up the issue of the rape of underage girls in her own constituency, she was swiftly and widely denounced as an Islamophobe and a racist, and at one stage had to receive police protection. It took years for central government, the police, local authorities, or the Crown Prosecution Service to face up to the issue. When they finally began to do so, an official inquiry into abuse in the town of Rotherham alone revealed the exploitation of at least 1,400 children over the period 1997 to 2014. The victims were all non-Muslim white girls from the local community, with the youngest victim age 11. All had been brutally raped. Some had also been doused in petrol and threatened with being set on fire. Others were threatened with guns and forced to watch the violent rape of other girls as a warning should they tell anyone about the abuse. The inquiry into the abuse found that although the perpetrators were almost all men of Pakistani origin, operating in gangs, staff of the local council described their nervousness about identifying the ethnic origins of perpetrators for fear of being thought as racist. Others remembered clear direction from their managers not to do so. The local police were also found to have failed to act for fear of accusations of racism and of what this might do to community relations. The story of Rotherham, like that of a whole series of similar cases in towns across Britain, partly emerged because a couple of journalists were determined to bring the story out. But all the time, the communities from which the men came showed no willingness to confront the problem and every desire to cover it up, even at the courts after sentencing. Families of those accused claimed the whole thing was a government stitch-up of some kind. When one Muslim in the north of England spoke out against the gang rape of white girls by members of his own community, he said that he received death threats from fellow Muslims in Britain for saying so. Everywhere, the story was the same. Girls were chosen, in the words of the judges who eventually presided over the trials, because they were from a different community, were non-Muslim, and were regarded as easy meat. Many of the men had brought ideas about women, and especially about unaccompanied or unprotected women, with them from Pakistan and other male-dominated Muslim cultures. In the face of such attitudes towards women being expressed in the United Kingdom, every part of the British state failed to stand up for what had been British norms, including the rule of law. The kindest explanation would be that the influx of huge numbers of people from such cultures made the authorities nervous as to where to draw their own lines, but it was more than that. Every time grooming scandals occurred, it transpired that the local authorities turned a blind eye for fear of causing community problems or being accused of racism. The British police remained scarred from the Macpherson Report of 1999, which had charged them with institutional racism and feared any repeat of that accusation. End quote. The cover-ups, the failures, the scope. In one town, 1,400 children raped over a roughly, 17-year period, 97 to 2014. That's just under 100 girls per year. In one town. In one town. I mean, that sounds like almost all of the white girls in this town. I mean, I don't know how big the town is, but it's astonishing. And the failures that occurred at every level, the local councils, the local police, and the same story up and down the United Kingdom, all over. Massive rape gangs covered up by the authorities because of their cowardice. They threw these girls to the wolves to save their own reputations. Betrayal of the highest order. To sit and allow that to happen and say nothing because you don't want to get called a racist. the scorn that these people deserve. And the more you find out about it, the more you realize that in some cases, the police were participating in the gang rapes. Not just any police, the Muslim police. Lo and behold, he's participating in the rape gangs. Again, there's no punishment too severe to rectify this situation. And to be perfectly honest with you, the failure is so great at every level of authority that it's my opinion that the United Kingdom is incapable of governing itself and needs to be forcibly taken over by the United States of America and made an American protectorate while these people face trial in Washington. I don't believe that the United Kingdom is capable. It's not a part of the European Union. So it's none of the Europe's business what we do. We should go over and we should completely take over that country. It has proven itself incapable of self-management. And it has committed a betrayal, the likes of which I don't think exists in the history of the United Kingdom going back thousands of years. I don't believe there is any betrayal ever that can match the betrayal that the United Kingdom has seen under its present leadership and under its leadership ever since the end of World War II. So that's how I feel about that. I thank you very much for listening. I'll talk to you again next time.